One of the interesting things about this time in history is that so many of us heard Dr. King live or saw Dr. King. In fact, there are a few people who actually worked with Dr. King. Martin Luther King came along at a time when it was absolutely critical and strategic to have a major voice, a major personality, a major spokesperson whose articulation and whose activism embodied the passions and the desires of black people. If you came up in the King era, and Martin Luther King for you is not just an historical name, but a real role model and a real personality, you've inherited a kind of legacy which for me is taken very personally. I say personally in one instance because I literally went to work for one of Dr. King's significant staff members, Jesse Jackson. Reverend Jackson would often quote Dr. King and talk about things that are not in books and aren't in the movies and aren't a part of the public domain of the King legacy. And so I inherited a very Martin Luther King perspective on the world, on African Americans, and on myself. It carried over really even beyond my employment with Operation Push to my friendship with Coretta Scott King. She would call me from time to time and she would compare things that she knew I was doing to things that she knew her husband had done. For instance, I was in Jamaica one time doing some writing, and she called me in Jamaica to tell me that Dr. King would go to Jamaica and write. And it was a kind of eerie feeling, but it kept me connected to at least the principles that Martin Luther King stood for. It culminated with Coretta Scott King asking me to be the keynote speaker for the big Martin Luther King celebration in the year 2000 in Atlanta, Georgia. I say all of that simply to say that the King holiday for some is another holiday. It's a day to take off from work. It's a day to go shopping. Or even more significantly, it's a day to do volunteer work or to connect to some cause-related organization. For some of us, it's really a time to think very seriously in terms of what are we doing that would either be the kind of work Dr. King would do had he lived. Of course, he'd be 90 now, and hopefully he'd be successfully retired. But what kind of work today is as relevant and meaningful to communities, particularly communities of color, as Dr. King's work was to the nation and to black people back in the late 50s and early 60s. Today we need leaders by sector. We need leaders in technology, leaders in education, leaders in religion, leaders in other sectors. And so rather than having a black leader, we have many black leaders specializing in the areas of development that will enhance the future of black America. What I've tried to do is to understand all aspects of Dr. King's work. You have to remember that he was only a public figure. He was only a public activist for 13 years. He started in 1955 with the bus boycott after Rosa Parks refused to move her seat, and he died in 1968. So his career only lasted 13 years, but they were 13 impactful years, and there are aspects of all 13 years that have guided me and have instructed me as relates to either being a minister or being a government official or being an entrepreneur. Here is the perspective that brings me to the conclusions that I've come to and that really guides my work every day, and that I want my staff, especially my young staff, to understand. Despite the fact that King is described as a civil rights leader, his movement and his preaching was not just philosophical, not just theological, it was deeply rooted in economics. And I'll call the first aspect of that economic awareness. Today you would call it financial literacy, or back in the day we'd call it economic consciousness. In his speeches, Dr. King, for instance, would talk about the income and spending power of black Americans, and he would describe us in proximity to other countries And he wanted us to be very, very keenly aware that although we had been denied our rights and although we were the victims of discrimination, merely by the fact that we consumed as much as we did and that we spend as much as we do, it made us a significant force with which to be reckoned. That was critical. And when you listen to Dr. King, you'll find embedded in his speeches throughout all of the years an understanding of economics, of finance, and the power of money. The Montgomery bus boycott was a boycott. It lasted for 380 some odd days, but to withdraw financial support from the bus company put economic pressure on that company, and it was the economic pressure as much as any other factor that broke the back of segregation. Dr. King was a strategist, and the strategy was heavily dependent upon economics. The Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until 1965, and so voting to elect good people to enact relevant legislation was a later strategy. The strategy that Dr. King employed, the strategy that he picked up from Mahatma Gandhi in India, the strategy used even before Dr. King by Adam Clayton Powell Sr. in Harlem, the strategy for fighting for civil rights and freedom for black people was always an economic strategy, not singularly, but certainly the core strategy was financial. So economic consciousness, economic awareness, and today my work includes exactly that. When we talk about D-free, freedom around eliminating debt and deficit living and delinquencies, that flows directly from my understanding of the leverage that comes from understanding your economic power. So economic consciousness. And then, of course, economic strategies. In Dr. King's last speech, he talked about organizing boycotts and withdrawing support, not only from the bus company that had denied people of color the rights that they deserved in 1955 in Alabama, but in Memphis, where he died, he talked about withdrawing support from companies that did not hire black people. He was in Memphis to support the efforts of garbage workers to have a decent, livable wage. And so economic strategies, we've included in our D-Free campaign not only education, but actions that address predatory lending. In some cities that I've visited over the last few years, we've actually picketed payday loan stores. The payday loan is the crack cocaine of the financial services industry. The payday loan industry functions legally, charging a minimum of 390% interest. You can go into payday loan stores, and there are posters on the wall that will tell you if you borrow $700, you will pay 800% interest. It's right there. It's on their websites. And so what we've tried to do is educate people about payday loans, but also challenge payday lenders to lower their interest rates. And we think now we have an alternative that we'll be able to introduce to people as an economic tactic. There are times when you have to protest what you don't like, and then you have to build what you need. And so Dr. King's legacy leaves for us a blueprint of economic tactics. And without economic tactics, you can't have economic capacity. And that was the other legacy that Dr. King left for me personally and left for us as a community. In that final speech, he talked about having bank accounts and opening bank accounts in the African American Bank in Memphis. He talked about black insurance companies. And in so doing, he was describing economic capacity. After Dr. King died, there were a number of people, many of them were preachers, whose focus was on becoming, as it were, the next Martin Luther King. And a lot of people would identify people and say, he's the next Martin Luther King Jr., she's the next Martin Luther King Jr. I think what we have grown into is building out his legacy, not by trying to become the next him, but by continuing to fight for and develop those principles and those outcomes that he stood for. D-Free is, for me, the continuation of the King legacy. Bernice King wrote an endorsement for the D-Free workbook, the D-Free textbook, that said that this work is a continuation of the work her father not only fought for but died for, that we grow our economic capacity. Today, African Americans will spend over $1.2 trillion, and the spending of money is not to be the only relationship we have with money, that we have to save, that we have to invest, that we have to own. That's all a part of economic capacity. And so when you look at Martin Luther King Jr. and then you look at D-Free, economic awareness, economic strategies, and economic capacity are both the themes of Martin Luther King Jr. and the core emphases of the D-Free movement. And so when we talk about D-Free, being free from debt, delinquencies, and deficits, so that we can be free to make deposits in our own bank accounts, earn dividends from our own investments, have deeds with our names on them, I believe that the D-Free movement is in fact the civil rights movement for the 21st century, and that millennials and Gen Z, as they pick up on the D-Free movement, will be functioning within the tradition, the great tradition of the person who probably made the greatest impact on this nation in the 20th century, and that is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.